Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the From Here On live streams. And good afternoon to those of you in Australia, New Zealand, and good morning to our early risers from UK and Europe. So please take a moment to introduce yourselves in the comments. Let us know what you do and where you're watching us from. So today's topic, From Here On, the activation system behind transformation. So today, Hugh and Alexis are sharing what they learned from sitting down with 36 senior technology leaders across 5 cities in Australia and New Zealand, what actually happened after the strategy got approved, and the activation pattern that made the difference. So the next 45 minutes will be practical and insight-led. So make sure to drop your questions in the chat and on LinkedIn or on YouTube. And we might not have time to answer it live today because there's a lot to get through, but we'll definitely make sure that we follow up after the session and answer all your questions. So I'm Jana Martins, talent and community lead here at From Here On, and I'm going to pass it on to Hugh and Alexis to introduce themselves, please.
Thanks very much, Jana. Hi, everyone. My name is Hugh Evans. I'm the CEO and one of the founders here at From Here On, and we're an architecture and transformation firm that works with technology leaders in regulated enterprises, usually. We help clients get governance, architecture, and decision-making working together so that the right work gets prioritised, the right calls get made, and change gets delivered. And we're also deploying agents with clients right now that keep those disciplines running day to day. And we're going to show you a bit of a sneak peek of one of those a bit later. Over to you, Alexi.
Thanks, Hugh. And hi, everyone. Great to be here. I'm Alexis Sauvage. I'm leading the architecture and activation practice at FromHereOn. I was involved with you in all of those collaboration events that we are about to share with you. And I'm just looking forward to walking through some of the practical insight that came from that research.
Okay, so last year we sat down with 36 technology leaders across Australia and New Zealand, and we went through a series of collaboration events across Brisbane, Perth, Melbourne, Sydney and Auckland, and a few of you are actually joining us today, which is awesome. What we found was a consistent set of activation patterns with organisations that were getting it right. So today we want to walk you through these 5 patterns and how you can make them work in your organisation. Over to you, Alexi, just to introduce the 5 patterns.
Thanks, Hugh. So for this research and engagement with those transformation leaders, 5 key activation patterns emerge on how to make strategy real and how to turn this into actual moments of value. So today we are going to step you through each of them with some practical insights. So first, we start with strategy activation. So we'll be looking at how to make sure strategy doesn't just live in a deck, but gets embedded and rooted into your day-to-day decision-making and ways of working. Then we'll be looking at delivery momentum. So this is one thing we heard from the research where there's a lot of friction. So we'll be looking at tactics to move past those crucial coordination points and drive some effective collaboration across the teams. Next, we'll be looking at architecture activation. So how you activate the architecture function to connect the dots between delivery and strategy, and really to help accelerate the work that needs to get done. Then we'll be looking at monetization as the thing underpinning all of this and the unsung hero. So we'll be looking at patterns and tactics on how to make those invisible foundation visible, and importantly, how to make those concerns everyone's concern, not just for technology. And last, we'll be looking at the AI enablement. So we'll be looking at the operating prerequisites that leaders need in place to get AI working with discipline.
Now, let's start with strategy activation. What we learned is that the problem isn't bad strategy, it's the operating model around it. Every leader in the research observed a gap between their strategy and the operational impact they were actually achieving. And the consensus was that it takes around 12 to 18 months to embed a new technology strategy into organisational routines. One of the metaphors we've adopted from the research is that of a tree. So rooting strategy into day-to-day decision-making requires deep roots. So not just getting the strategy deck approved, but effective portfolio reporting, board language that resonates in their teams, cultural buy-in, rolling prioritisation, and strategic architecture as the spine. and ultimately connecting to the teams and their lived reality. So the deeper the roots, the more durable the strategy. Now, Alexis is going to take us through some of the strategy activation insights.
Yeah, and let's make this concrete based on the patterns we heard repeatedly through that research. So strategy activation isn't about getting the strategy deck approved. It's about creating the resonance with the people involved in making this real. So people providing oversight, the board, and down to, and very importantly, people doing the work. And creating that resonance, that requires some very deliberate mechanisms. So if we start with the board, securing that buy-in from the board and creating that translation that is effective for them. So one very strong tactic that was shared with us was from one of the leader that reframed his entire technology strategy to fit into a 5x5 risk matrix, because that was the language that the board connected with, that risk conversation. And so they spent the time to really map those technology initiatives to risk categories. So mapping platform consolidation to risk reduction, technical debt to regulatory exposure. And what I did is, instead of debating platforms, they talk about risk exposure. Instead of defending architecture, they were discussing capital allocation against risk quadrants and risk appetite. What I did is really change that dynamic with the board to a point where that created and secured the funding for them to get started on the transformation.
Yeah, and that resonance at the top has to connect all the way down to the teams doing the work. In several organizations, teams are busy, they're shipping features, upgrading systems, and hitting milestones, but they were not connecting with their work with the strategy. And the pattern that worked was to get teams involved early and to co-design the strategy before it was locked. One chief digital officer shared a rough straw man of the target state and let teams translate it into outcomes meaningful for their business. They did it future back, and teams got to put their fingerprints on it, to challenge it, to translate it in their own language. And it slowed things down a little, but it meant the roots were deep. And we all know that transformation can be grinding. So one leader recognised she'd had several past strategies, many good strategies, but they never quite took hold the way that they were intended. There was passive resistance, an attitude of, here we go again. So in this case, she made it tangible and different. They created a new brand for the transformation and identity. And with it, they created a mascot that was actually AI generated with the AI tools. In fact, the mascot was called Frankie the Frog, which was drawn from a Frenchman I will not name. But the frog idea was all about evolutions, and Frankie started showing up across all of their literature. It became a rallying point, and they ran competitions around the mascot. They used AI tools, and this might sound a bit twee or trivial and may not be appropriate for your organisation, because I guess you've got to calibrate these things. But in this case, it created energy and it created curiosity and participation. So the lesson here is people don't always embed, if they don't feel part of something, they don't get connected to it if they don't feel part of it. So there are tactics to approach that.
And Frankie was such a great name. One of the other bigger structural shifts we heard was about funding. So one of the leaders described their annual funding cycle as the Hunger Games for money. And I think as soon as he said it, everyone in the room laughed. Everyone could connect to this. So every year, same fights. So that annual funding that was really driving behaviors of protectionism, everyone trying to protect their own slice. While the strategy itself was fine in setting the direction, that annual funding process, that was really killing it. So because strategy requires some real-time trade-off, and that just couldn't happen with that 12-month funding cycle. So what they did, it was to shift to a 2-month review cadence where business leaders came together and really using this as a forum to track whether they were still backing the right bets and whether they were getting the outcomes they expected. And so what I did with this forum is to start surface and review some key trade-off and to reallocate funding where it makes sense. And in those sessions, they also use this as the space to drive more collaboration across the group. So they use some rotating deep dives where each business leader in turn did a bit of deep dive in their own space and helped getting some problem sharing, and really just having some effective collaboration. And so that rhythm, that 2 months rhythm, that really replaced this once in a year existential funding crisis onto something that really is starting to embed and tune and adapt the strategy as they went.
Yeah, and when you get the rhythm right, there's a question of whether the strategy survives the next leadership change, because some environments, there are frequent leadership changes and strategy documents get rewritten with every new CIO. The organisation that maintain momentum tend to create fewer but more durable artefacts, and they work with perhaps principles rather than plans. These are paired with routines that keep them alive regardless of who's sitting in the chair. So this is more about deep-rooted plants that survive the changing of the winds. If you don't have those roots, translation, funding rhythm, visible trade-offs, you're not activating strategy, you're just reporting on it. Strategy doesn't tend to fail because it's wrong. It often fails because the operating system doesn't change. And if strategy activation is about changing the operating rhythm, the next question you've got is, once you have the direction, what truly makes the work move? And that's delivery momentum.
Yeah, and when we unpacked delivery momentum in those sessions, we kept coming back to one idea that momentum is not about methodology. It's really about coordinating the work that needs to get done across the team to drive that strategy, to create that value, to make that change stick, and really remove any friction along the way. And that friction, that really came up a lot in those conversations, and in some probably very predictable places. So we heard about friction in making the work visible across the teams, in managing the capacity of the teams, making those invisible dependencies visible. How do you manage intake of emerging work? And a lot of this really came back to aligning people and teams. And a common starting point we heard to reset or accelerate that momentum was around a big room planning event, and usually triggered by reset moments. So the picture you can see on the top here, this was a big room planning event that one of the participants led and happened to facilitate. And for them, the organization was halfway through the transformation, but the transformation was drifting. So strategic alignment was sleeping, delivery was hard, it felt heavy, and while technically everything was tracking amber to green, people knew that this was not going to land on time and budget. So the metrics said fine, but the system was certainly telling a different story. And so they used this big room planning event as a reset mechanism, and really as the way to drive alignment. So alignment back to this enterprise priorities and outcomes, but also to align people from the executive, the delivery leadership, digital operations, and really to start the tough conversations. So making the non-negotiables explicit, and to start stopping some of the work for them to move forward. And so when you look at that picture, this is what people saw when they entered this room, this big room. And so the first thing you saw was this 15-meter long roadmap from floor to ceiling. And straight away, what you could see is a lot of the work, most of the work was happening in year one on the left-hand side. And so straight away, you had that reaction that the system is broken, is reorder indexed into the early part of the roadmap. And as you step closer, as you can see those participants here, then it was really hard to connect all those detailed work packages to the strategic priorities. And so that visual, that really created a sense of urgency for people. So as soon as people saw it, there was a sense of urgency, and we probably have to step away from our streamlines and really look at this at the enterprise level. So that reaction, that visual reaction, that could not have happened over a spreadsheet or the steering committee. You need to visualize that complexity for people to respond to it.
And from the research, it's obvious that the first big room planning session is usually quite rough, and that's very normal. In the case that Alexis is pointing to, it was a bit rough and ready because they hadn't done it before. But the real output is that the teams have looked each other in the eye and made a commitment to sequencing. And the dependencies that came out of that example were gold. You get agreement across the room that you just simply can't digest what your ambition is. And you start to understand the collisions in the work streams, and what's actually delivering the critical outcomes. One organisation explicitly framed their first approach as an MVP, as a test and learn, to de-risk it a bit. But the truth is not everybody can afford the full ceremony.
Yeah, I mean, big room planning is expensive, and actually one of the chief digital officer at one of the university told us, look, I love big room planning, but yeah, they are really expensive. And her version of big room planning very quickly involved more than 100 people. So getting the faculties, central IT, group IT, digital delivery. So what she did is to run big room planning just to reset that momentum, but then she really looked at adapting this to stay through the principles of driving that visibility and working through the dependencies, but calibrating this to what makes sense from a cost perspective. So they shifted to quarterly small room planning. So looking at some key reps, of course, the squads, architecture, and the portfolio, but very much the same principle. And what's important is to keep that frequency going, to start building that rhythm. And that gave us the foundation then to layer in more and more rhythms. So it's time to introduce the monthly syncs and fortnightly alignment touch point as well. And what it in parallel as well was to start building a visible single view of the work to connect all of this. So look at connecting strategy, architecture, portfolio, and delivery, and essentially providing like a dashboard onto the dynamic roadmap. So what was really important for them was to find a rhythm that worked for them, and also being cost conscious about it, because the momentum is not in the event itself, is the rhythm, the cadence at which you are going to run those events.
Yeah, and even with the right format, plans do get overwhelmed. One of the participating organisations finalised its annual plan, but within a quarter they had 67 new initiative requests. And the lesson is that the operating cadence matters more than the plan itself. You need a standing intake process that absorbs new demand without derailing existing commitments. And also, not everything can be agile. You know, core technology work, platform migrations, infrastructure overhauls, that's open heart surgery. You know, it's multiple organ transplant. You can't iterate your way through that. And recognising when to iterate and when to plan deeply is a maturity signal. So without visible capacity, explicit dependencies, and disciplined intake, you don't have momentum. You have motion. And when you start pulling on delivery momentum, you inevitably end up at architecture, because the question becomes, who's connecting the dots across all of this work?
Yes, and one thing we heard over and over, and I think this will surprise anyone listening today, was, look, we've probably had 3 or 4 goes with enterprise architecture, but that never worked out. It was either too late, too soon, too much, too little. And that's a pattern we see across most large organizations. EA keeps failing, and not because the discipline is wrong, but because it's mistimed or mismatched to what the organization needs or what it can absorb. And the answer is in more architecture. It's really to calibrate architecture to those needs and the readiness. And so when we unpack those statements with the participants, there were 3 very predictable patterns at play. So the first one, and this is the one we saw the most, was architecture is involved too late. So all the key decisions are pretty much done. Delivery is almost on the way, trade-offs are locked, and architecture is very much reacting at this point in time. And one of the participants brought this to life in terms of how this was not connecting with the need of the business. So he was giving this anecdote of one executive forum where he was in, and one of the top business leaders said something along the lines, guys, I just want one platform. Stop this bloody nonsense. We just need to do it one way. Now, that top leader, he wasn't asking for a technical diagram. He was really expressing frustration about that lack of enterprise coherence, about having those trade-offs not being framed clearly. And that was really calling out that architecture had a place to play at a higher level, that higher mandate. The second pattern where we saw architecture failing from participant is sort of the mirror image from that first one, is where architecture is elevated, but too early. So with this mandate expanded and authority increased, but not necessarily with the experience, the relationship, the credibility, and enough proximity to delivery to back it up. And so we had this cautionary tale from one organization where they elevated the mandate of their architecture practice at the start of the transformation cycle to really be a driving force to shape that change. So big expectations, big authority, but there wasn't the credential, the trust wasn't there. And very quickly, they introduced more friction to a point where within 18 months, they had to dismantle the practice. The third pattern we see, and quite a lot as well, is how architecture is drifting into compliance function over time. So not by design most of the time, but more by habit. So it feels documentation heavy. You have this big, thick reference architecture, 100-page plus that no one reads, or it's really hard for teams to connect these to the work they need to get done, the user stories they have to build. Governance forums feel like gates. Reviews feels like policing, and essentially architecture at this point just become friction. And what that means is people just start finding ways around it.
EA is about understanding where the value levers are for the business and rebalancing architecture's focus and effort accordingly. Good architecture actually isn't a document, it's a conversation. And what we heard from leaders who do this effectively is it must be co-designed with the business. So this becomes a question of recalibration, and it's about getting architecture involved at the right level. In practice, it's often translated into a measure shift up and left, as you can see in this diagram, which means engaging earlier, shaping bigger picture decisions and influencing where value is created rather than reacting to downstream design choices. And that repositions architecture not as a policing function or a governance gate, but a way of getting people aligned on what we're doing and why.
Yeah, and so the reflection from this was that, when people say EA failed, what we saw wasn't the failure of the discipline, it was really a failure of the calibration. The ambition of architecture didn't match the organization needs, and really too late, too early, too early. And the organizations we heard from, who started successfully, just started with a honest conversation with the business about where architecture could value in guiding decisions, what decisions they could really help the business with, and what level of architecture the system could contribute.
Okay, I think Alexis got a connection problem. We actually were aware of this in our prep. So what I'm going to do is just take over. It's actually an activation problem of NBN in his neighbourhood, funnily enough. So, so just getting back to this, as he was saying, the organisations that restarted successfully had an honest conversation about where architecture could achieve the most value in guiding decisions and what level of architecture the system could actually absorb, and they built it from there. So to the next slide, Jana. Now, over the course of the year, as we were running the research, AI kept entering the architecture activation conversation, and leaders were, in fact, it was really interesting over the course of the year how the topic of the conversation really lurched to what they were doing with AI, certainly by the Perth and Auckland events. And leaders were looking at AI as a practical force multiplier to address some of those collaboration challenges we've been talking about. To help architecture scale, to shift architecture from being the bottleneck to being stewards of knowledge, to reduce single person dependencies and to remove friction points with delivery. So interestingly, the number one friction point that most participants wanted AI to help solve wasn't documentation or modeling or design, it was governance. And they were trying to answer a very practical question. How do we empower teams to move at speed? And how do we do this without increasing regulatory risk or exposure? Because in many cases, their governance model was already strained with too many forums, too many approvals, escalation-heavy decision paths, and one participant called it a gate state. And there was just a clear awareness in the room that if we layer AI on top of broken governance already, we're not going to create flow, we're just going to create faster bottlenecks. And so a really important insight from this research was how AI really needs a bespoke approach to governance to allow it to flow at the speed that it needs to go, while still providing appropriate measures of risk and security and comfort. So also what was interesting in this is that organisations making progress didn't start with let's automate the approval process. They stepped back and asked, what kind of governance model do we actually need? And several describe moving towards a trust and verify approach, which involved clarifying accountability around asset ownership, reducing mandatory approvals, allowing teams to self-attest against simplified guardrails, and basically making architecture advisory available but not imposed. One of the leaders in the research framed it as, this isn't less governance, it's actually smarter governance. Welcome back, Alexis, and you're reactivated.
The NBN is reactivated. So just beyond what you said, so once that governance was redesigned, then looking at AI is starting to make sense, and not really as a replacement for judgment around the decision, but really as the augmentation layer. So the leaders we heard from playing that space are currently getting to it, experimenting, but they are actively looking at using AI for quite a few things as part of that trust and verify model. So from the start, to help better shape the decision that needs to be made and governed, to scan at scale the violations of the guardrails, to help surface reuse opportunities, and also just to flag those emerging risk exposure, and ultimately just to better support some trade-off conversation. But the key consistent insight that came from this is using AI as a force multiplier for governance only worked because that governance model already had shifting to something that made sense for the organization. So AI amplified what was well designed, but it certainly didn't fix what wasn't.
Yeah, so architecture connects the dots, but the thing that keeps undermining architecture and strategy is the stuff underneath, the platforms, the technical debt, and the modernisation that nobody really wants to fund. You've never really heard any customer tweet praise about retiring a legacy system. It's invisible work with no external champions, and the organisations that make progress have found ways to make the retirement work visible to the board, not through technology language, but through risk and cost exposure, typically.
Yeah, and what we heard is it's tough to get monetization funded when nobody is taking notice and getting behind it. And we heard some interesting approaches about finding ways then to secure that funding. And this was really about finding the right stick to get started. So compliance and risk, that often came up as the driver to shift that narrative. So shifting from a technical conversation about modernizing system to a business conversation about risk exposure, and different narrative that led more often for a different funding outcome. So one organization in that conversation, in the traveling industry, they use those compliance requirements as the business case for an entire rationalization program that they've been trying to fund for years. So in that case, they use PCI DSS compliance as a key real material risk, and which was essentially the potential loss of their trading license. So they use that mandate as the vehicle to modernize their booking system and to bundle the technical work inside that compliance program. And the trick, of course, is once you have this one-off work, how you turn this into sustained improvement beyond that initial scope.
Yeah, and this is where consistently we heard that getting the funding model right becomes critical. One organisation that has cracked modernisation have embedded it into their domains with persistent funding. So no more projects. Domain executives are accountable. They own their technology health the same way as they own their P&L.
And tech modernization wasn't just framed as replacing old things. In fact, one of the most interesting challenges that came through the session was to the assumption that legacy automatically equals bad. And so several leaders pushed back on that. And what they said is age is no indicator of usefulness. And so what they say is, some of the systems they had 20 years ago, were cutting edge at the time, and some of them are still stable, well understood, and doing exactly what they need to do. And so the real question, as they framed it, was one about stewardship. So has the system been maintained, adapted, integrated, and actively on? And so it's stewardship, not age, that determines the currency and the value, and that's what really should guide some of the monetization decisions.
And language matters in this case. Technical debt is something people roll their eyes at, and the leaders making progress tend to reframe it. They built a technology health score, a dashboard visible to the executive team that quantified risk exposure, compliance gaps, and the cost of inaction. And when the CEO can see a red number next to a critical platform, the conversation changes. One leader told us that they stopped talking about modernisation entirely. They talked about risk reduction, cost avoidance, and regulatory readiness. It was the same work with different language, and it got funded.
Yeah, and the ownership question kept coming up. So in most organizations, modernization sits in IT, and nobody in business is accountable for technology health. And the organization we heard making progress shifted that. So domain executive, business domain executive now own their technology estate the same way that they own revenue targets. So if a system in your domain has critical vulnerabilities or is blocking delivery, that's showing up on your scorecard, and that obviously has some performance implications. So that shift from a IT-owned problem to executive-owned accountability, that was the single biggest unlock we heard for sustaining the immunization funding.
And modernisation doesn't mean modernise everything. The lesson here is focus on a few things that keep the business running and that actually shift outcomes for the organisation, and everything else waits. And then, of course, there's the thing everybody wants to talk about or not, which is AI. And but what we heard wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't about use cases. It was about prerequisites.
Yeah, and if there was one thing that became very clear, it was that AI as a technology wasn't the hard part. The operating model is. So most of the organization we spoke to, they were not blocked by technology. They were really blocked by unclear ownership, heavy governance, no clear intake, and teams unsure whether they were even allowed to try things with AI. And so the leaders making progress did something very simple. They created that permission, that license to experiment. And one described it as freedom inside fences. So with clear boundaries around data, risk, customer impact. But inside those fences, try things, test it on real work, see where it breaks and see where it helps. And several leaders, very interestingly, deliberately stopped using the term proof of concept because POC felt like, you have to prove something to a steering committee. It's like a binary pass or fail. And if you put your toes in the water, you have to swim, whereas experiment felt like learning. So that shift in language, that sounds small, but that's starting to change behavior and ultimately culture. And so getting people to think of this as experiments, hypothesis-driven, test and learn, and decide what to do next. That was really, really important to start shifting the posture for them. And that shift in language, that connected to something bigger on how you think and manage and govern AI, and so how the governance is set up. And Hugh, I think we heard quite some counterintuitive approaches around this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that everyone in regulated organisations, they're nervous. Every leader is nervous about AI, about whether or not they're doing enough, and what it means to their organisation. But regulators, legal, risk boards, and the default reaction in many organisations was create a gate. But what many of the leaders told us was that sometimes painfully is that heavy pre-approval kills momentum, and that regulated companies often have too many controls. And one leader said they had to proactively push people to go and experiment. So the governance forum actually pushes teams to try things, the opposite of a traditional gate. And what we saw emerging was a calibrated governance, lightweight guardrails for low risk experimentation, stronger controls closer to production, not governance-free, but proportionate and structured as enabling forums, not approval committees.
And enablement without foundations is obviously dangerous. So no surprise here. Every one of those conversations came back to the same thing, data. So you cannot build on a foundation if you don't trust AI, and AI amplify whatever data discipline exists, whether it's good or bad. But what's very interesting, it was from regulated environments, and especially what we heard from a couple of leaders, something that really stuck with us was, for us, winning the AI game is not about being first, it's really about being safe. And one of the leaders we shared that had recently experienced a data leak. So you could see the scar tissues that was really clearly shaping that risk posture. And so it wasn't about slowing innovation, it was really about making sure that they could move forward without repeating that same mistake for them.
And AI economics are already shaping some team structures. One of the leaders in the research said, we can't get approval to hire another junior analyst, but we can justify an enterprise AI license. So this isn't a future state, it's actually happening now. Some organizations are redesigning roles around augmentation. Now, they're not replacing people, but asking, what does this role look like if AI takes a first pass? What does the human focus on now if it's actually effective? And the ones waiting for a perfect AI strategy tend to be falling behind, whilst the ones just redesigning in small, practical ways seem to be getting moving. So, the question of who drives all of this matters perhaps more than the technology itself.
Yeah, and when things start to wobble is when AI becomes confetti. So I think this was the expression from one of the leader, confetti of AI use cases, and I think everyone can visualize it. So everyone trying something, a lot of use cases popping up, but there is no visibility, there's no prioritization, and there's no clear path from the experiment to production. And one leader did something very pragmatic around this confetti of use cases. He created a digital front door with us. So one place where AI IDs land, and not to block them, but really to make them visible, express them in a consistent way, and really to help see patterns, to spot duplication, and to start connecting similar use cases across the organization. Because AI is not an IT problem, and when IT owns it, what we heard is, it really becomes solution looking for a problem. When a business owns the use cases and you have this right engagement model with digital, with IT, with the platforms to enable this, that's where the adoption accelerates. And so for that leader, we introduced the front door. Before that, there was just noise, and that engagement model, that really helped to create that momentum.
Yeah, so in this case, with this leader, we have actually been building the digital front door agent and supporting portfolio governance. It's in production, it's generating real value, and the activation layer we've been describing across all 5 patterns is exactly what the agents operationalize. So pulling this all together, strategy, delivery, architecture, modernization, and AI, what's the thread? What we've heard across all 5 of these areas is the same pattern. The strategy exists, the capability exists, and what's missing is the activation layer between them. The operating rhythm, the decision cadence, the governance that enables rather than gates. Alexi, your thoughts on looking across the 5 patterns, where does it come apart? Where does it break down?
Yeah, look, when you look across those 5 patterns, when it breaks down, it's really at that intersection. So the intersection between strategy and architecture, portfolio management, and the delivery system, that's the gap. That activation layer, the operating rhythm, the decision cadence, that's where the work is, and often there is no clear ownership of that activation layer.
Yeah, so often there's no clear owner. One of the key insights that came out of the Sydney session was that there's a real degree of entrepreneurship that's required to get this right. And what I mean by that is that you need to understand the forces at play inside the organisation and where the informal locus of authority sits, because This is what really drives adoption, understanding where opinion leaders, where the influencers, where the organizational forces are at play, and how to harness that and get buy-in in the right areas to drive adoption, alignment, and to mobilize. This is where activation actually happens. So sort of bringing this all together, the lesson here from all of this is that agreement is in itself is not activation. Having people nod at the table around a strategy and then walk out and do what they always did is often the experience of many people that were part of this research. And so what we've learned through this research and what it reinforces in our work is that it's not enough to diagnose a strategy gap. You have to go beyond that to actually bring it to life. And we've walked through the layers that sit between intent and impact, the techniques, the rhythms, and the insights that make this implementable. Because ultimately, the real test isn't whether strategy is sound; it's whether it feels different. When we actually implement this, are the conversations different? Are the decisions clearer? Are the commitments more aligned to the vision? And that's what it's all about. Is this changing the way that we're working, and can we feel this building? So the intersection between strategy and day-to-day delivery is the type of thing that we're also focused on every day. And from your perspective, look, if there's anything in this conversation that resonated, the paper goes a lot deeper into the insights. And there are a bunch of insights and practical tools you can use immediately in addition to what we've shared with you today. So just rounding this out, the link is in the comments for that paper. It includes the tools and frameworks behind everything we discussed. Also, if you want to work through any of this with your own situation, you can reach out. We do half-day and full-day design sessions where we can apply some of these patterns and surface some approaches for activating. And you're also welcome to pass this recording on to your communities. Not everybody can join real time, we know that, but it is available and you can catch the recording and you can certainly follow up. And any questions you might have, we can also handle asynchronously. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Jana, and thank you, Alexi. Thanks for your time. That was great, mate. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you, Hugh and Alexis. I'll make sure we'll drop the link to all this download the material, how you can download the material and watch the replay if you missed the beginning or the end. So I'll make sure all those links in the comments. As usual, please keep an eye on our Meetup group and LinkedIn page for upcoming online events. We're planning another one in May. But we also have a few exciting face-to-face events coming up in March, International Women's Day coming. And we're sponsoring Women in Architecture events in both Melbourne and Brisbane. So if you're in Melbourne, please join us on the 12th of March. We're going to talk about navigating a career in architecture. And if you're in Brisbane, please join us on the 19th of March for Architecture Beyond the Title discussion. Please feel free to share those events with anyone who will benefit from attending, someone who may be passionate about architecture or thinking about transitioning into the career, or senior leaders, because we have a great lineup of panelists for those discussions. So I'll drop the links in the comments as well. And of course, just a reminder to get notified about all the exciting events, please make sure to join our Meetup group, Modern Enterprise Architecture one. And of course, just follow us on LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel where we put all the replays. So whatever the easiest way for you to consume information. And of course, the last but not least, if you are like to work on exciting projects in business transformation, enterprise architecture, or AI architecture, feel free to connect and message me on LinkedIn. If LinkedIn messaging isn't your thing, you can also reach us via email, talent@FromHereOn.com. So whatever is easier. So, and thank you again, everyone. We pretty much have 10 seconds left, right on time. And we're looking forward to see you in the next couple of weeks, online or in person. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.